let's talk about, because we've talked about how we're eating too many carbs. Let's talk about where things go awry in the body, taking a carbohydrate right through the system.
Sure. Oh no, it's fun. And I in the book I use the book's called BioDiet, by the way. It's been out for a few years now, but so I use the analogy of Fantastic Voyage, which was a film I saw when they redid it, I think in the 80s or 90s, but it was a film where they shrunk these scientists down and injected them microscopically into this person's body. He was a diplomat, and they had to go and like fix something in his brain or whatever, and that's the only way they could do it, right? So but what it did is it gave you this microscopic view or world view of what the inside of your body looks like. So when we start, first of all, carbohydrates, they're all kinds of sugars, basically. It's glucose, fructose, galactose, lactose. There are different combinations of them. So glucose and fructose is what we call table sugar. And glucose is what's in our blood. So when we talk about blood sugar, it's glucose. Table sugar is glucose and fructose, 1-to-1. And fructose, we can only metabolize in our liver, and it produces toxic side effects, which we can talk about a bit later. But that's one of the big problems. That's why I say the first thing to do, get sugar out of your diet, because half of that is fructose, and it's a toxic chemical, which we shouldn't be eating. Which is funny when people talk about other things being chemicals. Like, well, they're all chemicals. So, so if you talk about the basic sugars, the ones that taste sweet, we call those sugars. If they're connected together in big long chains, we call them starches. So there's, plants, we call it starch. In animals, we call it glycogen. But they're just a whole bunch of glucoses stuck together. And those can be broken up and released into your blood. And then there's fiber, there's soluble and insoluble fiber, which is also glucose, but it's connected together a little bit differently. So it's not used as an energy source metabolically. And there's debate about whether, you need fiber or not. You don't need it, but whether it's beneficial or not. And I personally think it is. So it's probably a good idea to get some fiber in your diet, especially soluble fiber. And we can talk about what happens to that. But let's go back to the carbohydrate, the sugars. You ingest it, you swallow it. Not much happens in the stomach, but all these connections have to be broken down before they can be absorbed through the wall of the intestine and then absorbed into the blood. And if it's not glucose, it has to go to the liver to get converted into glucose. And sometimes that creates toxic side effects like fructose. So when you eat a lot of carbohydrate, you're going to have a lot of glucose going into the blood. Now, glucose in the blood is necessary. You need to be between about 3 to 5 milligrams per 100 mils. It's a different measure in the States, 100, deciliters per liter, something like that. We have different ways of calculating that, but the number in the States is 100. Here we're looking at 3 to 5. At that level, it's normal. So your tissues will use it as needed, and in particular your brain, because your brain cannot metabolize fatty acids, cannot metabolize proteins, so it needs to metabolize glucose. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about the need to eat carbohydrate because your brain needs carbohydrate. But what they're forgetting is this process in your liver called gluconeogenesis, which literally means making new glucose. And your liver can make all the glucose it needs all the time naturally by using non-carbohydrate sources. You can use glycerol and amino acids and so on. So we don't need to ingest any carbohydrate. But when you do, and you get all this glucose into your blood, you have to take it out because excess sugar in your blood is effectively toxic. It causes inflammation. It will be stored, and when it's stored, it tends to be stored in fatty tissue because your muscles can only store so much as glycogen, not a huge amount. Your liver can store quite a bit more, but there's a limit to that. And then where does it go? It can't stay in the blood because it will cause damage. It will cause damage to tissues. It will cause chronic inflammation, and your body kind of knows that, speaking teleologically. So your body says, okay, we got to get it out. How does it get it out? Insulin. So your body releases insulin, and that affects these certain receptors called GLUT receptors that allows the sugars in your blood to be drawn in mostly into your liver and your muscle cells. But again, if there's too much, some of it you can pee out, if there's too much, but there's a limit to that. And if you have chronically high levels, you're going to have problems. So that's what happens to the glucose And when it's stored, it goes back into these glycogen stores. So your liver sticks them all back together until it's ready. And then there's a hormone called glucagon, which does the opposite of insulin, breaks them apart again, releases it into the blood. So ideally, you have a blood sugar level that's flat. And then the fibers, so the starch is broken down into glucose, so it's the same thing as sugar. So when people say, a potato or whatever, a potato is sugar. It's a big ball of sugar. It's just in a different form, but it is really a whole bunch of glucose. Rice is sugar. Pasta is sugar. They're all just sugars that are connected together, so we call them starch, but arose by any other name, as Shakespeare said, right? So the fiber is a bit different because of the way the bonds are connected together. The soluble fiber can actually be broken down and ingested, but it's broken down not in the gut, but not in the upper gut, but in the intestine by host bacteria. And it's actually absorbed as short chain fatty acids. So it's not absorbed as glucose; it's absorbed as fat into the blood. So it does have some energetic benefit to the body. The insoluble fiber is just bulk, and people argue that helps things pass through the system and absorb water and so on and so forth. So I would view it as kind of benign, and then there's other kind of more complicated views of the different starch types, but I think we should leave that there, and then we can talk what happens after that. I'll let you respond, and then we'll talk about what happens at the cellular level.
No, that's a great overview. And then where the problem happens, and you've alluded to this, when we're pushing through carbohydrates or sugar in the diet, we're either having too many at once acutely, or chronically, we're having a diet that's too high in those. And what this does is going to raise the blood sugar, again, either an acute spike or over time, it's going to keep elevating that blood sugar. And then insulin has to up its job, and I'll have you take it from there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll throw it back to you. Let's talk about what a standard American meal looks like. So what do most people, and Americans, Canadians are Americans too, right? It's North America. So what's the standard diet? You get up in breakfast, what do most people have?
I would say cereal and milk, or toast and peanut butter.
Yep.
Maybe a smoothie if they're a little bit more health conscious.
Orange juice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Juices, milk.
So orange juice is Coca-Cola with orange flavoring. It's loaded with sugar. How about yogurt? Yogurt, if it's not, it's loaded with sugar. Bread is sugar. Cereal was invented, and you can look this up, to stop people from masturbating.
Kellogg again?
Kellogg,
He comes up on the show periodically.
Okay, good. So people know that's why cereal was invented. But, my colleague, a highly esteemed colleague at the BC Cancer Research Center, where we did our research on the breast cancer study, Dr. Jerry Crystal, he just, when he hears cereal, he just goes, "Oh, it's horrible stuff. He's cereal." But what do? They give it to Howard Moscovich, and he puts salt on it, he puts sugar on it, and he makes it taste so good you can't stop eating those Honey Nut Cheerios, or what, they just taste great. And then so the cereal companies go, "Yeah, but with milk, this is a really well, it's the milk that's giving you all the nutrients." So yeah. So, and then the orange juice is sugar, the yogurt's sugar, the cereal is sugar, the jam is sugar, and you're putting sugar in your tea or coffee or whatever. So you're loading up with sugar. What does your body do? Huge amounts of insulin are required huge abnormally high amounts, which we call hyperinsulinemia. So that would be acute hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin in your blood now to combat the fact that you have too much sugar in your blood. And insulin is a very beneficial, very, very powerful hormone that has multiple effects, one of which is to draw sugar out of the blood, one of which is to promote protein synthesis, but it also affects salt balance in the kidneys, which we can talk later about how ketogenic diets can help control hypertension. And it also affects our brain hormone system, the leptin and the ghrelin, which are the kind of, ghrelin is the go, I'm hungry, and leptin is kind of the stop, you're full hormones that are released by your brain. So it's really powerful, but what it also does is bias the storage of glucose in your blood to either be burned in the muscles if the glucose levels are fairly low, but it's a very steep curve. As soon as the glucose levels get higher and the insulin levels get higher, heavily biased towards storing as fat. So if you're eating that high sugar breakfast, you're basically telling your body, store fat like crazy, right? And so then you think, well, go burn it off, right? And we have a phrase in kinesiology: you cannot outrun your fork. A bad diet is not corrected by a lot of exercise. And yes, you should get some light exercise, just to walk around the block after meals. It really helps with that insulin signaling to get it to burn the sugar that you've just eaten in your diet and not to store it. So as I say, in fact, just before this, I had breakfast and I went out for a little walk for half an hour just to get to that proper insulin signal to my body, so that I wouldn't store any of the food I've had, any of the sugar that I might have ingested as fat. And it burns it. So, my triglyceride levels are super low all the time because I'm burning fat all the time. And my blood glucose levels, of course, are completely steady all the time because I'm not really consuming any carbohydrate to much degree. Maybe 50 or so grams a day, something like that. Probably less most days, and some days a little more. I've been known on my birthday to have a Guinness. And it's funny because when you work in labs like the ones we have with all the very, very sophisticated equipment, you can kind of test your blood and see the effect of things. And for some reason, Guinness doesn't do much to my ketone levels. It doesn't knock me out of ketosis, even though it's got some carb in it. So my body's probably, I'm part Celtic, so probably pre-adapted to drinking Guinness, I guess. But that's only on rare occasion. So then you're this high insulin levels repeat themselves after lunch, because what do people eat for lunch? Soup with noodles, sandwiches, again, maybe a soda, which would be awful, but or the classic burger and fries and soda. That's loaded with carbohydrate and sugar and all that sort. Even if it doesn't taste sweet, there's lots of sugar in there too, in the form of starch. And then you have your dinner, and of course, even chefs will say, well, what's the starch in there? You have to have your pasta, rice, bread, potatoes, whatever. It has to be with every meal. It doesn't. But so what you're doing is you're elevating your levels of glucose abnormally high all day long, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And the result of that has to be excessive insulin in the blood. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And so then we have this chronic state of hyperinsulinemia. And what does that do? All kinds of bad things. So hyperinsulinemia, or excessive insulin in the blood, it's like anything. When balanced, it does wonderful things. If it's too low, you're going to be sick. You have diabetes effectively. If it's too high, it's also going to cause problems, like any other hormone. And so you're unnaturally elevating your levels of insulin in your blood on a standard American diet. The SAD, aptly named acronym, the SAD diet is going to artificially elevate your glucose levels, therefore your insulin levels all day long. And hyperinsulinemia, name the disease. There's about 70% of chronic diseases are either the root cause or an aggravating element is hyperinsulinemia. So it's really bad for chronic disease, and we're doing this to ourselves day after day. And I think it's largely because we're told that's a healthy diet. So it's so if you look at the cellular level, let's look at the difference. What if you just take that carbohydrate out and its managed level doesn't go to zero? So there's still sufficient glucose there for your brain to use and for your muscles to absorb, and you can still go out and do your athletic activities. There's some adaptation, but let's talk about that later. But if you take the carbohydrate out, well, your body goes, well, I still need energy. So there's all this fat. That's what fat's for. It's like, I view them as glucose is kind of like kindling on a fire. It burns quickly, burns bright, burns hot. Fats are kind of like Presto logs. I guess that's a name brand, but they're kind of like, good solid logs. You put them on the fire, they burn for a long time, they release heat gently. And it's a much more efficient, effective, cleaner way to fuel your body. And if you do that, what you start seeing is all these symptoms and signs of chronic disease start to reverse themselves. And we see that again. I should say, first of all, I'm not a physician. Secondly, so this isn't medical advice. This is just science, right? I'm just talking about the science. So you could view it as wellness advice or health advice. But ketogenic diets work for about 7 out of 8 people pretty effectively. The other 8, there are varying reasons why it might not. People are all metabolically different, and things don't all work the same for everyone. And there are some contraindications. So in my book, BioDiet, I think it's on around page 100. It's the first start of chapter 2, which tells you how to do it. First thing you should do is talk to your physician. and see if you have any of these contraindications. Now, most of them are, pretty rare genetic disorders that have to do with the metabolism of the ketones that are produced. And so you're very unlikely to have those. But there's some other, liver and kidney conditions for which it might not be recommended. And so I'm not a physician. I can't, recommend to people from a medical perspective whether it's appropriate or not. And the other thing to consider is because some of these benefits, like better control of blood sugar, better control of blood pressure, if you're taking medications for those, so anti-hyperglycemic drugs or anti-hypertensive drugs, you need your physician to know so that they can provide a concomitant reduction of those medications as your conditions improve. And, for diabetics, which is a condition where you have excessive blood sugar, we've seen people that have been diabetic for decades, like more than 10 years, and they go on a well-formulated ketogenic diet that's monitored. And we've seen people in 4 or 5 weeks, no medication needed whatsoever. It completely reverses the type 2 diabetes. Now, we're told, and I don't really care because my stakes are low, but we're told we can't call that a cure. So maybe we shouldn't, because what we're asking people to do is eat a natural human diet, and when they do, they get healthier. That should come as no surprise. But we're told that it has to be a reversal, but not a cure, because they have to continue the intervention in order for it to be maintained. And see the difference there? And here's another good point about obesity. And this is a very simple rule from obesity research everywhere. If you become obese or overweight and you lose that weight, whatever you've done to lose that weight, you now have to do for the rest of your life. So pick carefully. Now, some people like exercising and do that, and it helps them control their weight. That's great. But really, the most effective way is to change your diet, which, yes, means you're going to have to go through some significant lifestyle changes. And they may be cultural. There's lots of cultural things about eating certain foods and so on. You will need some discipline, and you will need to plan a bit. But for 7 out of 8 people listening there, they're the ones in poor metabolic health, I can tell you what the science supports is that if you can adopt a well-formulated, physician-monitored ketogenic diet, you're very likely to reverse the poor metabolic health you're in and return yourself into good metabolic health. And it should happen within roughly 12 weeks for most people.
That's incredible news. I want to come back to the part of the story when you're talking about blood sugar being elevated, causing the insulin to be released. For people that are feeling like, okay, why is my body doing this to me? Why is it being so, 180 working against me physiology-wise? And I just want to highlight the fact that it really isn't. It's actually protecting you, because if that blood glucose kept going up and up, that would cause all kinds of problems. The insulin needs to come in to regulate that, to protect you. And then it has nowhere to put all this extra glucose. So that's why it gets stored as fat. So your body's actually protecting you with this mechanism, and it only goes awry when we abuse our carbohydrate intake over time.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it better. And actually, who says that really well is Peter Attia. Peter's got a new book out now too. I haven't read it yet, but and we don't agree on all things, Peter and I. We don't have discussions. I've never met him or talked to him, but he is a very, very clever guy, and he does have a message to say. In one of his TED Talks, he talks about, he's a physician being in there looking at a diabetic that needed some limbs, amputated because of their diabetes, and why this was happening. And he was saying, well, the obesity is your body's reaction to the excess carbohydrates, trying to protect you from that excess sugar in your blood. And it has nowhere, it can't burn it. So the only place it can go is fat. So you can think of obesity as your body's protective way of preventing excess sugar from causing the damage it does in the bloodstream. And if we then look at, well, not all diabetics are obese. I mean, there's a huge correlation there, because I would argue it's the same disease. Cardiovascular disease is the same disease. Cancer is largely the same disease. It's a metabolic issue. So, but there are, we call them skinny diabetics. Skinny outside, fat inside, SOFI sometimes. So their outside of their body might be very lean and skinny, but inside they have a lot of fat around their organs and so on. And their outcomes are actually much worse than obese diabetics. They have shorter lifespans, bigger challenges managing their blood. Why, again, going back to what Peter Attia was kind of suggesting is, well, their bodies aren't very good at storing fat. So because they can't, the blood sugar has nowhere to go except stay in the blood. And when it stays in the blood, it causes the damage that we associate with, later stage unmanaged type 2 diabetes, which is, loss of vision, loss of limbs. It's mostly circulatory issues. And this is a result of the inflammation that excess sugar causes in the blood, systemic inflammation, we call it.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
7 out of 8 people are overweight or obese, which means they're metabolically unhealthy, which means they're sick. We have a phrase in kinesiology, you cannot outrun your fork. A bad diet is not corrected by a lot of exercise. And we know it's really effective at reducing obesity.